Hi, my name is Linda Berenius, and I work as Head of Development at the Global Challenges Foundation, a non-profit that works to strengthen global governance to handle global catastrophic risks. Welcome to this seminar, both you who are here in Sharm el-Sheikh and you who are with us online. This is a seminar on climate adaptation and business opportunities and responsibilities. As the impacts of climate change gets more and more severe with extreme weather events and rising sea level that threatens communities and countries, the world now need to focus on climate change adaptation. While mitigation, that refers to actions preventing or reducing emissions of greenhouse gases by, for example, increasing the share of renewables, adaptation means anticipating the severe effects of climate change and taking action to prevent or minimize the damage they can cause. And in this seminar, we will explore opportunities and challenges for the business private sector, because the private sector has in many ways taken a leading role in mitigation, but a similar business-led movement on adaptation needs to be developed. So first, I would like to welcome on stage Her Excellency Aminat Shona, Minister of Environment, Climate Change and Technology in the Republic of Maldives. So please, welcome on stage. We're honored to have you here. Can you please tell us about the situation in the Maldives and other small island states?
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Linda, for your invitation to speak here this morning. I think most people know where the Maldives is and what our situation is. We're one of the most climate vulnerable countries. 1,200 islands in the middle of the Indian Ocean. Most of our islands are just about a meter above sea level. Our population is just about 500,000 people, but we also have over 1 million tourists who visit the Maldives every year. We are witnessing and living every day with the realities of climate impacts. Every single island in the Maldives, freshwater lens has been contaminated by saltwater intrusion. Every single island is eroding at an alarming rate. We are seeing today that our coral reefs are bleaching at an alarming rate as well. And as we know, we are also a country that is so dependent on our ocean for both income, protection, and also for food as well, because of the connection to fisheries. What happens when our coral reefs are degrading slowly, but not so slowly anymore? It impacts our fisheries, it impacts our tourism as well. So climate change and its impacts is not something that we will live with, but it's something that we are living with today. We are seeing it. Unpredictable weather has become the norm. Monsoons have changed as well. Every rainy season, we have to struggle when our islands are flooded. As we know that the Maldives, although it's a very small country, described as a small country usually, we are a very large ocean state. We are about 800 kilometers from north to south. We occupy about 90,000 square kilometers of ocean. When we think about it, we are the 30th largest ocean state if we consider the ocean that we occupy. So climate impact has a direct link on what happens life below oceans, and degradation of these ocean resources. Entire mix of unpredictable weather makes life, doing business, and living in the Maldives very complicated. And 1.5 really is the magic number. 1.5, if global temperatures reach beyond 1.5, I can't imagine how my home will be like. And I don't want to imagine that, so we have 86 months to go. And within these 86 months, we have to find a way to limit global temperatures to below 1.5, because if we overshoot that, we're currently, the impacts that I've just described is at 1.1. If we overshoot 1.5, it will be a tremendous challenge in every possible way to live in the Maldives.
Thank you. And one question here that I'm wondering about, could you please give us also some examples on what concrete solutions are needed for your country? Because sometimes I have a sense that, especially from the private sector, the term adaptation gets a bit abstract, but still things needs to happen on the ground. Can you just give us one or two really concrete examples of solutions that are needed?
I think for a lot of people, when we talk about the impacts of climate change, it also becomes so complex. It also sometimes feel like we can't do this. But I'm here to tell you that we can do this. We can find a way to find solutions together. One good example is that in COVID, the world came together to produce vaccines in just 6 months. The world came up with trillions to help each other to come out of the pandemic. And now, with the war in Ukraine and Russia, the world has again come up with trillions to help with the war. So there are ways, there is money, there is technology available to do this. For instance, our water resources are depleting, and currently in the Maldives we are working to have a combination of rainwater harvesting with desalination, with inclusion of renewable energy into these projects to be able to provide reliable source of clean drinking water to island communities. We also have a vast ocean that we can use to produce energy. Again, mitigation for Maldives is also adaptation in the end. We are a country that spends about 10% of our GDP on importing fossil fuel to fuel our economy. But we also have sunshine in abundance, which is why we are transitioning to an economy fueled by sunshine by 20. We have a target to reach net zero by 2030. There's all kinds of technology that is being tested and that's been put out there to provide energy using ocean resources. The Maldives, I see, is, although small, can also be used as a laboratory to test this technology and scale up this technology as well. And we are open for these. Also, when we think about adaptation, we're talking about safe disposal of waste in the Maldives, in countries like the Maldives. I think one of the areas that we often forget is what about the environmental problems within our own countries. Waste management is the number one environmental problem in the Maldives. And in this regard, we have a policy now in place which we are implementing to phase out single-use plastics in the Maldives. And we have seen since the implementation of this policy, import of single-use plastics have significantly gone down. But for this, we also need alternatives. We are a country that is so dependent on tourism as well. So we need to connect with businesses who have alternative products that can link up with small island communities like this as a measure of adaptation in waste management, renewable energy, as well as sound adaptation measures.
Thank you for these also very concrete examples and for setting the stage. I would now like to welcome up on stage Victor Bernard, who is a program, you can just please come up, is a program officer at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Just please stay. And I'm thinking that we will save the applause for a bit because otherwise we won't have time for discussion so much. So we will save that for next part. Thank you. So Victor Bernard, Program Officer at Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, and Jimena Liva-Roche, Director of Global Initiatives and Head of Peace, Climate and Sustainable Development from International Peace Institute, and also the former focal point on climate for Guatemala, and now also working closely with the Minister Shona on climate change adaptation. So maybe a joint applaud for both the introduction and for the new speakers. So, Jimena, what is the status for adaptation in international climate negotiations and policies right now?
Thank you, Linda, and thank you for organizing this event. And thank you, Minister Shona, for setting the stage so beautifully. It is a bit premature to say where we will end at the end of COP on adaptation. So, but if we envision an ambitious COP27 outcome in Africa, it has to have strong and very concrete and specific outcomes on adaptation and loss and damage. I think the world is ready to see action and leadership. So we are really expecting strong announcements at this COP on how are we going to address adaptation and loss and damage. Strong and ambitious words in a covered decision are no longer enough. So we're hoping that out of this COP, aside from strong and ambitious text, we also get strong and ambitious commitments on action on adaptation that includes member states, but also business, as well as the banks and the international community at large. Thank you.
Thank you. And Victor, I wonder, the UN General Assembly declared this summer that a healthy environment is a human right. What are the implications?
Well, thank you so much for that question. The implications are manifold, like this, right? Yeah, okay. As you... So, yes. All right, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Well, as you all know, there was a declaration at the UN General Assembly that was just adopted, recognizing everybody's right to a healthy environment. This is a very interesting resolution. It's a historic move, actually, for people and planet, because it not only addresses states, but it also links the right to a healthy environment to business conduct. So it explicitly references the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, noting its relevance and its application to environmental context, and that all enterprises have a responsibility to respect human rights, including in climate change adaptation context. So this phenomenon, climate change, is as much an environmental crisis as it is a human rights crisis. And this landmark resolution will affect, or hopefully will affect, countries' conduct in this area in many ways. For example, it moves us closer to a universal recognition of the right to healthy environment as a standalone right, where many countries will now seek to incorporate it into their constitutions or domestic laws. Secondly, it will accelerate the adoption of environmental and climate change policies and standards, hopefully in the climate change adaptation field among states, but also businesses. And it will, most importantly, it will strengthen the access to justice for victims of climate change and environmental degradation by giving them an additional framework to rely on to hold states and businesses accountable. And we can see that now growing in Asia within the field of climate change mitigation, but now also climate change adaptation, as seen recently in Pakistan.
Thank you. And this sounds a bit hopeful to me. And Minister Shona, how would you like to reflect on this, and also on how you think that the UNFCCC process can assist small island states and other vulnerable countries in the effort to undertake adaptation actions?
We have been working to agree on a global treaty on climate change for decades now. The Maldives has been at the front line of voicing about the need for an urgent agreement. The longer we wait for an agreement, the more costlier it will be for us to fix things. I think it's well overdue now for a global treaty on how we address climate change. It's really important that the outcomes of this agreement is easily accessible, equitable, and also predictable in nature on how we are going to address it. The 1.5 really is the magic number for us, and that's where it started as well. It started about mitigation and adaptation, and because we have failed on mitigation and adaptation, we're now in loss and damage. So for countries like the Maldives, a global treaty where all of us agree on the urgent need to cut down our emissions, to keep global temperatures below 1.5, is for the survival of the planet, not just for the Maldives. We all know that we are not only the people who are being affected by it. Of course, we are the frontline states now, but look what's happening in Europe. Look what's happening in Pakistan. Look what's happening in India, in China, everywhere in the world. We are seeing it. And we must not think that these events are just isolated events. All of these things has global impacts in terms of supply chain issues, in terms of global food supply, and this is going to have a massive impact on our cost of living, on our economies, on our political systems. So the most pressing issue of our generation is addressing climate change, and that the heart of this problem is mitigation. Unless we are able to quickly agree on mitigation targets, on how we are able to agree on reducing emissions and addressing loss and damage for countries like the Maldives, it's going to be a very, very complex world.
Thank you. And maybe over to you, Jimena, on how, I mean, this is so complex, and it's such a huge challenges. And here we also have a bit of focus on the private sector and businesses and so on. From your point of view, how do you think that business could start to get involved in adaptation on a bigger scale than today?
Thank you, Linda. I think that it's now clear that governments alone cannot address climate, and that we need the private sector. And if we look at the precedent of how the private sector started to get involved with climate, it really had a great push in Paris, right? In Paris, there were really the first big commitments from certain business in the mitigation space. And out of that collaboration, big coalitions emerge that contain public and private entities. I think that's where we are today for adaptation. Right now is the moment where we want to see big, strong coalitions on adaptation emerging in this and in the next COP. And we would be delighted to support that effort.
Thank you. And Victor, how do you think that also the human rights support measure, how can that is that the most important thing for getting businesses involved, or are there other, from your point of view, other aspects that are more important? What would you see as the key to getting businesses more involved?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I actually don't want to use human rights as the tool. I mean, I also heard somebody else speak about the litigation strategies that they've been using against businesses. Of course, you don't want to sue your own country. You don't want to sue businesses. Well, you would want them to act accordingly in the first place. But we believe that in this context, where things are moving very slowly, especially on loss and damage, we believe that human rights is one of the few tools that you can use to actually highlight the point of how countries that have least contributed to climate change are now bearing the heaviest brunt of the consequences. And trying to rectify that, well, the environmental treaties and instruments don't have that in their core framework. So human rights is there to complement that, to supplement it. And we hope, for example, that human rights will play a big role in developing jurisprudence at the international level. I was in a session on, with someone who is presenting a petition to the International Court of Justice, representing Vanuatu, which aims to compel the court to issue an opinion on the obligations of countries to protect the rights of present and future generations from the harmful impacts of climate change. And I'm assuming that my colleagues here is supporting those initiatives. But whilst this legal advisory opinion is very broad in scope, we hope that it will lead to general obligations of states to protect the rights of future generations, but also create concrete duties for polluters to address the loss and damage which the poorest countries are suffering from. So this is just to give you an aspect a perspective of how human rights at the international level is being used. But of course, adaptation as measures need to also be grounded in human rights, because they can also have human rights implications. So that's another perspective that we'll probably talk about more later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we will now move on to the next section in this seminar, where also we will have a presentation of the role of business in climate adaptation. But first, I would like to thank you both, especially thanks to Her Excellency Minister Shona for the very nice introduction and informative introduction, and also to Jemina and Victor. So thank you so much. And then I would like to invite Richard Klein on stage, who is a team leader of International Climate Risk and Adaptation and a senior research fellow at Stockholm Environmental Institute. And yeah, Shona, if you have, maybe you have to go, but if you have time, you can also comment on the next steps. But I know that you have another, and you have the negotiations, so you decide. Thank you so much for being with us. Richard, I wonder, why do businesses need to care about adaptation beyond their own value chains?
Thank you very much, Linda. First of all, for inviting us, my colleague Mikael Mikkelson and myself, to prepare a background report for this session about the role of business in adaptation, and then, of course, also to speak here at this event. I think it's very timely. Yesterday, UN Global Compact, the UN body that tries to connect the private sector to its objectives of sustainability, also issued a report on the role of business in adaptation, and particularly on the focus of just transition. So in my comments, I'll try and link the messages of those two and highlight, I think, the growing role of the private sector when it comes to adaptation to climate change. But before doing that, let me just go back a few years in time. When we talked about adaptation maybe 10 years ago or so, we thought about adaptation as, well, first of all, for some people it was seen as something politically incorrect. It was something that distracted from the actual purpose as they saw it for climate policy, and that was to reduce emissions. Fortunately, we have gone past that. We need to do both. When I talk about adaptation, that's not because I think adaptation is more important than mitigation. Both are needed. If we don't mitigate, then at some point we won't actually be able to adapt anymore. But if we don't adapt, then all the impacts and risks that are already in the pipeline that we are committed to on account of past emissions will not be addressed. So we need to do both. The other thing 5 or 10 years ago was, or perhaps still even, is that adaptation is very much seen as a local issue, as something that every impact of climate change is unique, and we need to have locally led adaptation, and particularly in the global south. So that's the framing of adaptation that we also see here in the UNFCCC, and I think also that companies are sort of having to address. And when it comes to, for example, investments for the corporate sector, I think companies will be looking at climate change adaptation as either something that they will be affected by or as something they could benefit from. I think the picture is a little bit more complex. What the IPCC has shown in its sixth assessment report is that climate risks and climate impacts are increasingly complex and also increasingly difficult to manage. And that is because, to put it simply, we're all connected. We're all in this together. And we've seen that with COVID. One virus in China, within a matter of weeks or months, affects the entire world. And it also means that, you know, just like you said, that adaptation or climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's also a human rights issue. We saw that with COVID as well. It was not just a human health issue. It became an issue of just about every policy field in the world. And climate change and climate risk is working in exactly the same way. The same way that the virus can move from one place to another, climate risk can move from one place to another. And I'll give you an example. For example, the Maldives. We know the Maldives are very exposed to sea level rise, and we heard the minister speak about that. And of course, that's a very clear and direct impact. But 80 or 90% of the food that is consumed in the Maldives is imported. What happens when, because of climate risks or because of extreme events, the production of that food or the supply of that food is disrupted? Colleagues of mine at the Stockholm Environment Institute have looked at the way in which drought in Asia caused political instability and food insecurity in West Africa. Why? Because drought led to reduction in the yield of rice in a number of Southeast and South Asian countries. An export ban was instituted. It created a spike of the price of rice in the world market to such an extent that it was unaffordable to people in West Africa. These kind of connections are really important. That means for companies that it is not just a matter of looking at their own risk, which of course is being addressed through the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. It's also not an issue just of looking at where are the opportunities or what role can finance play. And we'll hear from our NABA and from Eric about finance and the opportunities later. It's also a matter of responsibility. And my final message here is that in the same way as mitigation can lead to winners and losers, and we are talking about just transition in the context of mitigation, whether it's Polish mine workers or people working in jobs that are dependent on the current fossil economy. There are people working, for example, at the very beginning of supply chains of agricultural commodities that could become the victim not only of climate change, but also by the actions of companies when they realize that, for example, the quality or the supply of these commodities are no longer what they expect. So in the same way that a just transition is necessary from a mitigation perspective, I would argue that companies have a responsibility to also look at what a just transition means from an adaptation perspective and how their actions to adapt in their own interests may or may not affect people that they are doing business with. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And you mentioned 2 papers here that are newly released, and there is also one of the papers, The Role of Business in Climate Adaptation. You can also download it on the Global Challenges Foundation's website. And the other report, where can people download that?
That will, I think it is available on the website of UN Global Compact, which is unglobalcompact.org, I think.
Thank you. So please stay on stage, Richard, and we will now move on to also some concrete examples on climate change adaptation solutions from two companies here with us. We have Eya Hitavua, Vice President and Corporate Affairs at Tetra Pak, and Jan Svärd, CEO at Easy Mining, with a long career in the chemical industry. And thank you so much for the introduction, and welcome up on stage. So first, I would like to ask you, Eya, can you give us some concrete examples on your solutions for climate change adaptation?
Very good. Yes. For those of you who may not know Tetra Pak so well, so maybe to start off, I should explain the company. So we are a company with Swedish origins, 70 years in existence, and what we do is that we provide solutions, end-to-end solutions to the food systems. So basically we have technologies and equipment for food processing and various kind of food design tools, as well as packaging solutions. So we are one of the world's largest in this area. So when it comes to responsibility as a business, so firstly, we've been very active on can you hear me actually? Yeah. So we've been very active and very progressive on the climate side. So we were one of the first companies with the science-based targets. We have net zero targets which have been approved by the Science-Based Targets Organization, and we basically have long-term and short-term targets. So that's kind of in the core of it. And when we look into our impact and when we talk about mitigation and when we talk about adaptation, where really we believe that we and our industry can make a difference, it is the food systems. And what we've done in this area, so we've worked together with FAO and some other kind of UN organizations and platforms, and we've developed different type of pathways which we believe that can be used and have a role to play in adaptation in particular, but in general in this food system transformation that we need in order to basically for people to have access to nutritious food and to survive basically. So I'm not going to take the time to explain all the pathways, but I'd like to give some examples of pathways that we believe are going to be critical. So one of them is what we call healthy food for healthy planet. And what it means is that we have existing foods available in existing format. They use certain raw materials, certain processes to make the food available. And we would believe that there needs to be a disruption in this area. And what we've been doing and working together with our customers as well is to look at alternative technologies, alternative materials. So for instance, in the case when we talk about Maldives, algae could be an alternative source of protein. It could provide the type of nutritional kind of benefits required in a country of 500,000 in population. It is of course quite early, nascent still in technologies, but for this size of a population, that, for instance, could be a solution. And developing a kind of a resilient system which may not have all the kind of assets that in a more developed agricultural country would have, because I understand that only 5% of the current GDP comes from agriculture. So it really needs to be thought over whether fisheries or agri would provide that. And we have great examples of not only from algae already, or fungi, of turning food waste into a resource, for instance, for animal feed. So technologies like that can be adapted, scaled, and look into the context of a given country. So that would be a very tangible example. And I have another one if you shall we leave it later?
We'll see if we can have come
good.
back to some, but thank you so much. And it's so good to hear also these very concrete examples. And algae and fungi sounds quite good. I don't know about the waste, but maybe you can tell us more about that. Please, Jan, what are your concrete solutions in the adaptation sphere?
Absolutely, I can do that. So I'm from Easy Mining, and we basically use what people now call waste and produce clean nutrients out of waste. So we don't really believe in this value chain. We think it's a cycle. You should always reuse what you have there. But of course, part of it is detoxification, because everything you used has been somehow toxified, so you need to be better in taking away what's toxic in the solutions. But one example that we always talk about in this respect is, nitrogen fertilizers. They are produced, you use air and natural gas. So of course, enormously energy intensive. It also, when you use it, it produces N2O in the wastewater treatment plant. And of course, it's a very potent climate gas. But what we do, we catch it in the wastewater treatment plant and produce a clean fertilizer of it. And we have actually come a bit on the way. We are not just wishful yet, but we are actually producing in a plant in Copenhagen today.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And I wonder, Richard, when you hear about these examples, and also I know that you have looking for other concrete examples, would you like to add any concrete examples on how adaptation solutions could look like from a, I don't think it works now, but hopefully.
Yes, absolutely. In our paper, there are several. I think when we look at solutions for adaptation, the first thing we are thinking of are what are the technical solutions, and you gave some excellent examples of that. There are plenty of other companies in both the global north and the global south who are, who see opportunities in adaptation. Adaptation is creating a market for them, whether that is through water engineering, whether that's through waste processing, whether that is in the public health sector. There are a whole number of different possibilities there. And this is exactly where, of course, it also becomes interesting from the private sector to seize on these opportunities, in addition to, of course, also looking at how they might be themselves affected by climate risk. But I would argue that in addition to the technical solutions, there is also a role for private companies within the governance of climate risk. The governance of climate risk isn't something that should be left alone to the public sector, to the UNFCCC or to national governments. As I said in my short introduction, we are facing a systemic issue where we are all connected, where climate risk can move from one place to another, cascade from one sector to the next, and within that system, companies play a role as well. And that also means that they need to play a role in governing that system in a way that is just, that respects human rights, and that could be through, alliances that already exist, through labeling, through working with local communities. Plenty of examples there, but my call here is to think beyond the technical solutions to also see what governance solutions exist.
Thank you. And I'm wondering, why don't we see these technical solutions all over the world? Where are the barriers? Since we have the technical solutions now, and why don't you do this all over the world already?
Yeah. No. First, of course, you need to solve it technically, so it's one big step. But of course, a lot of the best engineers and researchers want to work with this now. I say when we, just as a personal example, when we recruit to Sweden, we get applications from all over the world who wants to be part of solving this. So we have 10 nationalities in our lab in Uppsala. But apart from that, I think the big thing is that the legislation today is totally adapted to a linear economy. It is based on that you start in a mine and that you go step by step and then you put it on a waste somewhere on the waste pile. And it's not based on that it's circular. And so, for example, if you take these fantastic solutions we have for phosphorus, it cannot, July in EU this year, it was allowed to use a cleaner fertilizer than they have today. But in some examples, you cannot really apply it in the best place. So there is plenty of legislative hindrances, actually, that prevents you from doing this. So because there is a push and there is a demand, but this legislation is just too slow.
Thank you. Eija, would you like to comment on what do you see? Why don't we see your solutions all over the world?
Yeah, I think yes. So I totally agree that I think policies are needed in order to enable this, but maybe also, and I think we spoke about COVID and how it was possible to do things very fast. So in some areas, I think if there were collective initiatives funded, R&D funded on open innovation, for instance, to provide certain kind of low-scale solutions that could be deployed fast. I think that type of initiatives would be really welcome, because there are a lot of startups, for instance, working on the same things and getting separate funding for these initiatives. So pooling certain type of critical innovations and the funding behind that would enable then to scale up those solutions and bring them out. I think that's one thing. And the second thing is that I personally find it from the food systems side, which last year at COP26, it was totally still out of context. The topic was not at all discussed. So this year there are like 4 different pavilions about food systems. There's been a kind of a senior high-level meeting about food system, which actually was co-hosted or co-moderated by the Prime Minister of Sweden. There's a lot of progress on this topic, and now action is really needed. And while we are here now, there is actually a coalition of businesses getting together for a call of action for food systems. And yesterday I attended an FAO panel where FAO had a call for action in this area. So I'm actually quite positive that there is sort of drive for action. It's the means and the deliverables which we need to nail down.
Thank you. And I'm also wondering, maybe first I'll ask you, Richard, and then I will go over to you, that regarding climate mitigation, there is by now an established norm that companies have a responsibility to reduce their emissions in pace consistent with the Paris Agreement, and that means basically that halving the emissions every decade to reach net zero by 2050 by the latest. But still, that means that carbon will be emitted during this transition time. And while these carbon emissions will continue during the transition, those emissions will add to the damage to countries already severely affected by climate change. So why is it not considered as a responsibility for companies to also compensate for the losses and damages done to third parties?
Well, you will have to ask the politicians there. I think this is very much an area that's very dynamic at the moment. Within the UNFCCC, compliance mechanism exists, but it's not particularly powerful. But what we are seeing outside the UNFCCC, that increasingly litigation is being brought forward, not only to companies. The Netherlands is a good example where the Dutch state was seen in breach of its duty of care and was basically forced by court to increase its efforts on mitigation. But also companies are increasingly sued for non-action. It happens with RWE in Germany, with Royal Dutch Shell, and several others. I'm not a lawyer, I can't necessarily speak about that, but I think the Paris Agreement provides a very strong framework to also be used within domestic law in a number of countries, if not all countries, to ensure that companies take their responsibility. I think responsible companies will act before they have to appear in court, both on mitigation and on adaptation. And my call to companies is that don't only think at the risks that you yourself are exposed to, through, for example, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, but also think of the risks that you yourself might actually generate by your actions on adaptation and mitigation.
Thank you. And yeah, the same question then to A and to Jan. You can choose who would like to answer first. Do you think that, I don't think you have to answer just from your company's view, but do you think that the private sector has a broader also responsibility for the loss and damage that the continued emissions of greenhouse gases will, the damage they will cause during that transition to reach net zero by 2050?
I mean, this is going to be my personal opinion, but if we look at the current energy crisis, for instance, in Europe, and the fantastic goals that the EU came up with, the Green Deal, and how many things are now basically at risk in terms of the green transition, and then the oil and gas industry is making a lot of money out of this crisis-triggered situation. I think there is maybe a discussion to be had whether some of those profits actually should be allocated for the benefit of resolving some of this situation. But that's purely my personal opinion. I think there's a long history of certain industries which one could claim that they've exploited resources and things like that, and I think it would be a country by country call to see what has been just in the past and what should be just in the future, I guess, in this area.
Thank you. And John?
I do it completely personal then, because of course I've been in business all my life, and you know, people in business are the same as other people, and you still get a knot in your stomach from hearing the environmental minister in Maldives. So you really want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I think, again, totally personally, very little of the issues will be resolved in the courtrooms. I think it will be solved by real people in real businesses, of the engineers and the scientists and so on. And if they are prevented from solving it by they have to be locked into a courtroom, is not a good idea, in my opinion. But of course, you know, then again, there is companies that doesn't take the responsibility now. What they did 20 years ago is one thing, but they don't take the responsibility now. So I think a combination of sticks and carrots is the best solution.
Thank you. And then my last question for you in this panel, before we will also move over more to the finance side, is like in mitigation, we can see that the private sector in many ways takes on a leading role. Why don't we see the same movement now in climate change adaptation from the business sector?
This question is probably best answered by the private sector, but I think one of the fundamental differences between investment in mitigation, investment in adaptation, is the scalability of these mitigation investments. There are direct opportunities for companies to basically make money. In adaptation, there are those opportunities as well, but they don't necessarily scale as well, particularly when we see adaptation as a local issue. And that's also why I think we need to move away from the idea that it's exclusively a local priority. Of course, it is a local priority, but it is also a national to global priority. This is also what the Paris Agreement says. When I talk to finance people, I learned this wonderful word, bankability. It's about the bankability of projects, right, Eric? And Eric, I'm sure, will tell us all about how we can, through innovative finance, make adaptation investments more bankable. But I think it comes down to, you know, basically the bottom line of any private sector investment: is it going to give a return on investment?
Thank you. And very, very short answers now before we invite Dr. Aruna Bagash on stage. Eya and Jan, do you think we will see a business-led movement in adaptation solutions?
Yeah, but I think I agree with saying that, you know, scalability of a solution is very important, that you can repeat it over and over and over again, because it's a combination. If you want to, you know, refinance it, you need to make money on it, and then you need to be able to repeat it. And of course, the feeling is that a lot of the adaptation issues is a one-off. But then if you can repeat it in multiple locations and places and so on, then it also turns to a business, I think.
Thank you. Eya?
Totally agree on scalability, but also I think we need to look at new forms of finance and how you can create that kind of reassurance for the investment so that it is actually a proper investment that makes money at some scale. And I think there, if we look into the development of the impact investment areas, or pooled, blended fund, we'll probably hear a lot about that next. But I think that's probably a key element in triggering large-scale investment into this area.
Thank you so much to Richard, Eya, and Jan. Thank you. And finance is obviously a key. And I would like to first invite Dr. Arunabha Ghosh on stage, founder, CEO of the Council of Energy, Environment and Water, top-ranked among Asia's leading policy research institutes. Welcome. And why are the needed investments in solutions for climate change adaptation not happening, and how can this be solved?
How long do you want me to speak, Linda?
First, I want you to speak like 5 to 7 minutes maximum, and then we will invite Eric Usher, and then we have companies on stage again.
All right, thank you. I used to be in my school band, and you used to hold the mic like this to feel like a rock star, but now this is even golden in color, so it's like a concert performance here. Thank you so much for inviting me to the Swedish Pavilion. I hope you can hear me. You talked about finance. Let's just be very clear. The greatest, I hope you can hear me, yeah? The greatest crisis facing humanity is not climate change. That is only the second greatest crisis facing humanity. The greatest crisis facing humanity is a lack of empathy. It's a lack of understanding of the lived reality of people from other geographies, from other cultures, of other colors, of other genders. And if we don't internalize this, none of all of this matters. And this is, we claim that we have a shared humanity, but we don't actually. We don't have a shared humanity, not because we are not exposed to the same problems. We are. If 2022 gives any lesson, it is that the assumption that the poor would adapt and the rich would escape no longer holds. We are all impacted. But we don't have a shared humanity because how we respond to those shocks impacting us is currently different. So how do we have a little bit more of a level playing field in how we respond? So I want to, in the 4 minutes that I have left, Linda, I just want to illustrate to you 4 or 5 ways in which we can think about this in a more structured, problem-solving way. I think about adaptation and resilience not as a sort of slow boom approach towards an impending shock, but the rule of thumb I use is how quickly can I bounce back once I have been impacted. So if that is my rule of thumb, I have to then ask myself, what are the ways in which I'm going to be impacted? So think about it in 5 different ways. First, human security. Second, food security. Third, livelihood security. Fourth, infrastructure resilience. Fifth, macroeconomic stability. Now, can we have solutions that respond to each of these? And I would argue that we have examples and innovations that can bring in the public and the private in very concrete ways for all of these 5. Let's start with human security. In 1999, India, or rather the state of Odisha in India, got impacted by a major cyclone that cost 10,000 lives. 20 years later, when a similarly sized cyclone hit the same state, less than 70 lives were lost. Because of massive investment in early warning systems and being able to communicate that clearly in time to the communities impacted. Now that's one example. But actually, if you look at the Sendai framework, multi-hazard early warning systems is a requirement. Now, the state or the public sector might not always have all of those solutions. So you need to work with those who actually have that high data, big data capability to process the impending shocks and deliver those early warnings. And equally, you have to work with communities who can serve as your first line of defense to be able to relay that information. My colleague Milan here has been filming. We've produced 16 films across 5 states in India on what we call the faces of climate resilience. I just want to show you one, we've got some postcards we'll show you later. But a community radio station in one district in India is giving those early warning about floods and forest fires and so forth. Communities of rural women in the state of Odisha replanting forests and becoming the first line of defense. Communities, again, serving as forest firefighters. So there are ways in which big data and climatological analysis and early warning systems designed by the private sector can also work with communities on the ground. Very quickly, some of the other stuff. Food security. The severe heat wave that impacted all of us through this year resulted in about 10 to 15% in the decline in India's wheat output in the summer. But it also impacted France's wheat output significantly. Now, while Russia and Ukraine might be granaries and they are in conflict, France is the 3rd largest wheat exporter from Europe. So when we see this impact occurring in different parts of the world, you then can quickly begin to imagine what the food security challenges will be for food importing regions. So the role of the private sector then comes in terms of food insurance program, crop insurance programs. Livelihood security. Minister Shawna talked about mitigation and adaptation often being the same thing. So let me just give an example of what we at CEW have been doing, a program called Powering Livelihoods, using distributed energy to drive livelihoods in rural areas by supporting private sector startups. Now that is a $53 billion market in India. It's a huge fortune at the so-called bottom of the pyramid. One example, cattle fodder, which becomes scarce as the soils get degraded, water gets degraded. Solar-powered hydroponics to grow cattle fodder, green fodder, is a $4 billion market opportunity in India alone. So again, you have an opportunity to use climate startups, but also bring in mitigation on the solar side and adaptation. Fourthly, on infrastructure resilience. And this is where the role of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure becomes extremely important. Something that India has promoted, 31 member countries, but also an opportunity for international organizations and the private sector to come together. Every $1 invested in resilience and adaptation saves $5 to $6 in avoided losses. So when you're building the next bridge or the next power plant or the next airport or the next railway line, there is a clear financial payback if you invested in the adaptation story. And finally then, is the macroeconomic stability. We are impacted currently by a food crisis at a global level, a fuel crisis, an impending finance crisis, and an ongoing fever crisis in the form of a pandemic that's not really gone away. If you were a finance minister, you'd be throwing up your hands like, give me a break, right? Because a finance minister does not have a choice of dealing with one crisis or the other. He or she has to respond to all. And macroeconomic resources are running thin. So how can we use public finances to create a global resilience fund as a first loss insurance payout, but use the private sector insurance players to merge risks across different geographies to lower the risk curves and be able to spread the risks in a manner that actuaries and insurance agents can do better than anyone else. So what am I trying to tell you? We cannot fix for climate change or climate adaptation unless we begin to walk in the shoes of the vulnerable. But it's not just enough to have that empathy. It's also important to start thinking of those concrete solutions in human security, food security, livelihood security, infrastructure resilience, and macroeconomic stability. If we built up those concrete solutions, maybe next year, the global stock take, we can say, we actually not only know how bad it's going to get, but we also know how good we can be. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Arunabha. And please stay on stage. And I would like to invite Eric Usher, who heads the UN Environment Program Finance Initiative. Welcome. And I wonder, Eric, could you please just say a few words on your work and then also elaborate a bit on why should financial institutions and the private sector care about climate adaptation, and how can private capital be scaled for these needed solutions? Please.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Linda. And morning, everyone. Nice to be here on a Saturday morning. Everybody hard at work with the competition. Arunabha laid out a lot of things I'm going to speak further to. For those who don't know us, we're the part of the UN that has a very long-standing relationship with the financial sector. Actually, this is our 30th year anniversary. We were created at the Rio Summit. So working with the banking, insurance, and investment communities and essentially setting the standards or the norms for responsible conduct. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of developments we're seeing. However, I do want to start, from the picture painted in the situation of the Maldives, from what we've all watched in Pakistan, from the many situations. I do not want to give the idea that the private sector has the solutions to all needs. And absolutely, the very difficult situations that many vulnerable countries are in, public finance is critical, public assistance, and private sector can play a supporting role. One example, you've just painted it out, the role of the insurance sector. And we're actually very pleased, the V20 group of countries, so the most vulnerable countries, which actually is 55 today, have relied on us to set up a facility to bring the commercial insurance industry into trying to develop insurance solutions to manage risks, particularly within SMEs and within communities. And we know that the protection gap in terms of insurance cover within climate vulnerable populations is 90%. So basically people do not have insurance in the way that many people in the room do, not everybody. And so you cannot live with integrity if you do not have the ability to manage the risks that you face on a day-to-day business for your family, for your job. So I think that's an example of where the commercial insurance industry can be providing solutions in complementary working with the public sector. Now, I'm not going to talk so much about innovative finance. I believe the private sector is an engine of innovation. It can work with industry, finance, industry, with the development banks. Innovative finance is important, but I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not going to talk about impact investment. Impact investment, which is a form of innovative finance, is important, but I'm not going to talk about it. What I'm going to talk about is changes we're seeing broadly within the finance industry today, because I think we all have to acknowledge innovation is important, but scaling is is critically important. So it's not about doing something that's really innovative and doing a lot of publicity around it. It's about how can we change the matter of business, the matter of finance, the matter of government. And we are seeing changes that I think are positive. Now, once again, I don't want to imply that this is solving all solutions, but let me give a little bit more examples and why adaptation, we believe, is going to be taken much more seriously in the years to come. Now, Richard already mentioned one of the very important developments out of the Paris Agreement, or associated with it, was the French government asked the G20 to establish a task force on climate-related financial disclosures, TCFD. And it was a task force that set out a set of recommendations. How should corporates start to disclose? So report to their stakeholders. What are the risks they have due to climate exposures, both physical risks and transition risks. And now we talk about liability risks as well, because companies are going bankrupt because they're being sued. You talked a little bit about that early. So it was voluntary for the first couple of years, and then starting in 2019, New Zealand, UK, EU, even in the US now, the SEC, they're starting to make it regulatory mandatory. So we have a voluntary, the industry gets going, and then the regulators take over. So climate disclosure now is becoming the norm in the corporate world. Now, why is that important for adaptation? Part of the problem with adaptation is that it's not something you can have one small team within a large organization who has all the knowledge. It's something that has to be broad-based across the organization. And it's a very, it's almost a slippery concept because it applies to everything that you do. But in itself, you can't boil it down to the price of carbon. It's not one number. And so how you mainstream the concept is very, very challenging. But now we have the corporate community who has to start reporting where particularly the physical climate risks. So essentially everything that they do, how does that pose a risk in two directions? How does the changing climate pose a risk to what you do? And now this is a second topic, is a bit controversial. Do you have to report on the risks you have on the physical climate? And there are some different jurisdictional views on that. But the fact that big companies with hundreds of thousands of people, they don't do that from one office. They have to go across the entire organization, all of their business lines. They have to figure out what are the physical climate risks. Once you start to do that, you start to get the information to know about adaptation. Well, you know about the opposite of adaptation. If you don't adapt, what's going to happen to your business? So I think it's a really important first step. One. The second is that I think as you've all been hearing, there's been a lot of developments around mitigation, a huge mobilization. Once again, voluntary to start with, and this is this net zero push. We're involved. We manage 3 of the alliances under this GFANZ umbrella, including the biggest one and the most relevant one for developing countries, which is the Banking Alliance. It's a huge group. It's 40% of banking assets have set these targets. Now everybody's heard a lot about targets. What does it mean? How is it accountable? And now actually this week, the first group of 62 banks have issued their first interim targets, so for 2030. And it's science aligned. It's roughly in the power sector, average reduction 54%. So in 8 years' time, they're going to cut their emissions in half, which is, we know what's needed. Now they have to show that they can do it, so we have to wait and see, and our job is to create the framework and the reporting and the accountability so that it'll follow through. But what we're seeing today is that, once again, you don't have a team of environmental specialists within a big bank who are driving this. It's driven from the top, and you're seeing a lot of bank CEOs here this week. Why? Because their future is relied on getting this right. And I'm privy to many meetings where they, and also credit to my boss, the Secretary General, they go into a meeting and they don't have speaking notes any longer. They are living and breathing this stuff. And because they're doing it, there's no longer a small team in their organization who's involved. There are tens of thousands, I would say, leadless, hundreds of thousands of people in the finance industry who are dealing with this issue now. Because if you set a target, like in the power sector, everybody in the power sector division has to understand it, because the target is bottom up. It's not top down. The question is lending to the power sector. How are we going to reduce emissions? And simplistically, what are they going to do? Huge investments in renewables, and they're getting away from coal, no question. Whether they will say we stop financing coal, there's a legal issue, and I think people might be following what's going on in the US. There's some people you can't get them to say absolutely clear no because they're going to get sued. But the reality is this is the trend. And so coming back to adaptation, what does this mean is, once again, across these organizations, they are all involved with these issues. So this is the basis for them to basically then say, we're looking at climate, we're looking at solutions, but we're going to also be looking at the risks. And so I think the potential now to broad-based, which will drive the levers of innovation, which will drive the levers, and the banks particularly, how they see to reduce emissions, and not so simplistic as just dumping the asset onto the market and say we don't do it and someone else is going to pick it up. It's about working with the clients. So working with the food industry, working with the power industry to say, how are you going to reduce your emissions? How can we be a partner in that? And so I think there's a lot of potential. It's just getting started, and once again, the private sector is not going to solve it on their own. I think the new quantified collective, I have to get my letters lined up, the 4-letter word that is the new Copenhagen commitment will be very important. It is a strong signal of trust that needs to be set between developed and developing countries, and the private sector has a very strong complementary role to play. But let's not confuse public and private. Let's get clarity, definition of who does what through these high-level solutions and innovations, particularly from the private sector. I think we can get this done.
Thank you so much, Eric. And please stay on stage. And I would like also now our company representatives from Ragn-Sells, Jan and Eija from Tetra Pak to come up on stage. And first, Eija, I would like to ask you, as a representative from a big and international company, how are you engaging with financial institutions today on climate adaptation, or institutions as the UNEP Finance Initiative?
Yes, I must say that there's maybe one difference between companies, and that's when you're a publicly listed company, you tend to work with the investor community much more closely. So we are actually a privately owned company, but nevertheless we do engage quite a lot with sort of experts, but not within some of these coalitions which are investor driven, specifically targeting publicly listed companies. But I think these initiatives that were just mentioned regarding for financial reporting, the task force for climate, and now the nature, these are going to be extremely critical tools for driving change. And I think maybe, I think we had this other discussion which Victor was moderating on just transition the other day. We were also welcoming the inclusion of social aspects and just transition in some of these frameworks, because currently that may be missing, but that's maybe for my part.
Thank you. And Jan, do you, as a company, interact with those institutions? And we just heard that the private sector cannot solve this alone, but not either the other sector. So we really need to cooperate here. How do you do? Do you do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I just have to say you have a very good comment, because I worked, for 30 years in a listed company, and now I met with a big chemical company, and we could do things, but next quarter was the priority. And then, of course, it's very hard to do things. This takes a long time to establish. Now, Ragn-Sells again is a family-owned company with a family that is dedicated to create value for the next generation in a good way. So I think the driving force for this will be much harder with the ones that has the long-term perspective, like Tetra Pak or Ragn-Sells, so this type of companies. Having said that, of course, we have seen it is actually relatively easy for our ventures to get financing from banks and so on, because they want to participate in our venture. So I think we've seen a big change in the last 5 years from really short-term bank thinking, if you want, a little bit higher interest rate because you're taking a big risk, or the other way around now, where you see, okay, we see a value as a bank to participate in your venture.
And if I may just
very short.
just quickly, because the other aspect which I kind of didn't dwell into is of course in the area of food systems, you not only finance through the companies who may be in the food and beverage industry, but it really is the financing for the farmers, and that is a key kind of a key tools to find those, whether it's microfinance or something like that. But I think I'm, for instance, I'd really like to mention Rabobank for their efforts in this area, because Rabobank themselves it's like a cooperative bank, and the role in driving change, for instance, in the food systems, where there's a lot of cooperatives, that is a very niche area. So I think it's a broad-based solutions also in terms of finance. So should look maybe bottom up and top down as well.
Thank you. And for you, Arunabha, when you see these dynamics also between like different types of private companies, listed, family-owned, and we need all forces now. How do you see like the role of private investments and public investments, and how they can like come together to get this exponentially amount of finance needed in a very short time? What are the solutions?
That puts me on the spot. Let me just respond to this private companies issue. Of course, in the case of Tetra Pak, it's a globally well-known, well-recognized brand. So whether I knew you were publicly listed or privately listed doesn't really matter. It's almost like a consumer or a user of your products in a way. You almost expect that a company like Tetra Pak will be doing the right thing. And if you're not, then your brand equity does get diluted. But then there are hundreds of millions of smaller businesses that are also privately owned, that are not known, whose brand is not well recognized. They are part of the supply chain of larger companies which might be publicly listed. And as I served on the UN Secretary General's high-level expert group on the net zero commitments of non-state actors, primarily corporations. The report and the recommendations we brought out earlier this week makes it very clear that we've got to put a green line, we've got to put a red line on the greenwashing. And in order to do that, you have to be serious about Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions reductions. Now, if we take those recommendations to heart, then it also gives a trigger for publicly listed companies to then work with a long tail of maybe privately listed or private companies that are part of their supply chain. And therefore, then you're obligated, and your investors will ask you, what are you doing to adhere to not just your own direct emissions, but the emissions from your supply chain? What are you doing to work with the small, medium enterprises in your supply chain? That includes all the points that Eric has been referring to about disclosure of the exposure to various kinds of climate risks, including the financial risk and the physical risk and the liability risk. So that's one way to kind of, in a regulatory dimension, trigger that linkage between the public and the private. But I would, if I had to offer one more idea, I think one of the issues here is about the need for aggregation of projects that happen in smaller, in smaller capital sizes, which might have an adaptation role, but you're not able to kind of scale it up or not get attractive enough for large investors. So let's think of, again, small businesses that operate in clusters. Now, we've taken an approach towards cluster-based mitigation activities. I think it's important also to have cluster-based adaptation activities. How do you assess flood risk? Now, suppose you were a textiles cluster in Cambodia, right? It's a textile exporting least developed country. How are you assessing the water risk of where you're operating or the flood risk of where you're operating in order to continuously generate export-oriented revenues to drive the local economy, but also get the economy overall out of LDC status into low middle income country status? So I think this approach towards scope 1, 2, 3 is a way to link, and the other is to have cluster-based aggregation of adaptation-related activities, especially for small businesses.
Thank you, and thank you for also sourcing ideas here. That's great. And Eric, I would also like to hear from you. What role can UNEP play, since adaptation also is a global challenge that goes beyond national borders, and the world also needs systemic solutions. What can the role of UNEP be in this?
I mean, obviously, the UN does, UNEP does many things, works with governments, works with civil society, works with the private sector. I think it's very important that we get this relationship between voluntary action, commitments to things, and regulatory uptake over time. And, you know, regulating markets is a very difficult job. Getting it right is very difficult. And we're not always saying you always need more regulation, but for certain issues, they will not, like global challenges, you are typically often going to need, and in the high-level expert group report, which is excellent, the last recommendation is to set up a task force to move towards regulating these net zero commitments, which we believe is a very good move. However, if you go there too quickly, you set up a structure which is unmanageable. And so we need a relationship between private sector innovation and leadership, credibility, and then over time broad basing it across the entire industry, the entire, around the world. And this manifests in many ways, and this is where UNEP and other parts of the UN system are working to create the frameworks for credible action, public and private. And I mean, just to comment on, the very good points now, Sweden has a lot of very innovative companies, and I think part of the reason is because of some different capital structures, like your own and like Tetra Pak. I think IKEA, there are some others who don't have the pressure of quarterly earnings, and they can focus longer term, and that allows you to do innovation, which is very important. But I think, as has been pointed out, the public markets creates pressures on companies, and some of those actually help in terms of, as issues come up in terms of reputation risk, but in terms of responsibilities. For instance, in the oil and gas sector, you have publicly listed companies and you have a lot of private or state-owned companies. The response is different, and actually the public pressures often helps move things more quickly, is what we see. But the problem with those companies, you're right, is quarterly earnings calls puts pressure on them to not make long-term decisions. So what we need to come up is with, how do you merge the two, or how do you come up with models and pressures that get companies to move in a certain direction? It has to be business. It's not about philanthropy. But if you're inclusive with the externalities and you understand why adaptation, for instance, is so critical to your business going forward, then the private sector, whether publicly listed or within the private markets, will take the actions and provide the innovations that are needed.
Thank you so much. We will soon end this seminar, but I would like to ask you one last question. Since climate change and also, of course, mitigation, but also adaptation are global challenges, it's also clear that we need global collaboration to find the solution and scale up the solutions. And here we also need the collaboration between the UN, within banks, insurance sector, the private sector, investors, etc., etc., etc. So the last question for you, and just 1 minute answer maximum, 30 seconds is better. Where do you hope that we are in 1 year, next COP? Where can we be?
Oh, 30 seconds. No, I hope the step that I've seen, I've been on 3 COPs now, and I'm an impact investor too. So, and what I've seen is that businesses has really taken big strides since Madrid. Is really in the forefront and wanting to change things and so on. Legislators is not at all at the same pace. If the legislator can catch up with business now, that will I would like to see for next COP.
Thank you. Aya.
So I take a little, a bit different of an approach because, as you know, food systems are close to my heart. I don't know if this is working now. Does this work? Yep. So I will be, my hope is on the UN Food Systems Summit #2 next year, where all the stakeholders are going to be at the table, hopefully, because the first one wasn't, maybe it didn't work as well as possible. And climate, as well as nature and other critical topics are there. And we have the finance sector there, and we're all coming up with solutions and actions.
Thank you. Eric.
To take another recommendation from the H-Leg report, we need to see the private sector reporting in to the CCC on their net zero commitments so that we get a proper understanding and alignment between what private sector and public sector are doing to head towards serious climate action.
Thank you. Arunabha, please.
Yeah, I would hope that by the time we approach the global stock take, we have an initiative for hyperlocal climate risk assessments for developing countries set up. Without that granular database, nothing else is able to be operationalized.
Thank you so much to our eminent speakers, and thank you to you who has been here listening, and thank you to you who are listening online. Thank you.